Hello. All right. We are live. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see everyone's nice comments. Thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the launch of Geoff Mynett's Murders on the Skeena, True Crime in the Old Canadian West. Thank you so much for being with us here virtually. And I know that there are people from all over the country. So if you could let us know where you're from in the chat, that can be fun and interesting. All right, so for those of you who have attended our virtual launches before, this will be a bit of a repeat, but for those of you who are new, I'm going to introduce myself and go through some housekeeping. So my name is Malika, and I'm the Marketing and Promotions Coordinator here at Caitlin Press. Caitlin Press is an independent Canadian publisher located on Vancouver Island. We publish culturally significant books, including fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Caitlin Press is also home of Dagger Editions, which is an imprint for the voices of queer women identifying writers. Before we begin and get into things tonight, I would like to give a big thank you to the Government of Canada and the British Columbia Arts Council. We are so thankful for the funding that we receive from them. I would also like to give a big shout out to Book Warehouse Vancouver for being our bookstore partner. So Geoff actually went in last week and signed some copies of Murder on the Skeena. So there are signed copies available. If you want to order some, you can just click the green button at the bottom of the screen to order online from Book Warehouse Vancouver. I would also like to acknowledge that although virtual, this event does take place on the land of Indigenous peoples. Caitlin Press is located on Vancouver Island on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, New Channel, and Kwakwaka'wakw First Nations. We would also like to encourage everyone to read the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And Caitlin Press and Dagger Edition joins many others in asking the Government of Canada to honor all of the 94 calls to action. A little bit more housekeeping before we get going. The audience, video, and mic are not active, so if Geoff tells a spooky tale and you scream, nobody will hear you. We are recording and it will be available on YouTube after the event. Also for the chat, all users can see the chat, and the chat is not recorded to YouTube. If you would like to hide the chat, you can just put your mic in the top right-hand corner, and there's a little arrow. If you click on the arrow, the chat will disappear. There's also a Ask a Question button down at the bottom of your screen. So we encourage you to submit your questions by just clicking on the Ask a Question button, typing your question in the little box. If you see a question that you really want to make sure that we see and get to, you can click on it to upvote it. All right, so now that the housekeeping is done, I'm excited to give quick introductions to tonight's hosts and best-selling book. So part history, part true crime, Murders on the Skeena, True Crime in the Old Canadian West, 1884 to 1914, contains the true accounts of murders, crimes, and scandals, some of which remain unsolved to this very day in small-town northern British Columbia. Our host tonight, Crystal Henrickson, loves true crime stories and is very excited for the launch of Murders on the Skeena. She actually has a special connection to Hazelton, as her father-in-law was a physician in residence at Rynch Memorial Hospital, which was founded by Horace Rynch, the main character and focal point of Geoff's first book, Service on the Skeena. Crystal is the business partner of Geoff's daughter-in-law, Annika, and she and Geoff had a wonderful discussion for Geoff's last book launch, and they're really excited to have a similar discussion on so many interesting topics tonight. Geoff Mynett was born in England, where he qualified as a barrister. After immigrating to British Columbia in 1973, he became a Canadian citizen, requalified as a lawyer, and practiced law until his retirement. His first book, Service on the Skeena, Horace Rynch, Frontier Physician, from Ronsdale Press, received a Jean Clark Memorial Award and was a bestseller. His second book, Pinkertons and the Hunt for Simon Gunanoot, was published by Caitlin Press earlier this year and was also a bestseller. And now his third book, which just hit the shelves last week, is on the bestsellers list in its first week. So Geoff is a 3-time bestseller. Let's virtually give it up for this 3-time best-selling author and his wonderful host. I will disappear now and you guys can watch what you came for. All right.
Hello.
Hello. I know Malika just said to virtually give it up, but I'm here and you can hear me. So 3 times bestseller. Congratulations from me and everybody else who's saying congratulations in chat there. How are you doing?
Oh, just great. Thank you.
It's so good to be back with you and to get to read this new copy that I have here. It was such a good read. I'm curious about so much. But first, maybe could you introduce us to the book and what we could expect in it?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Caitlin Press and Vicky and Sarah and Malika for all their hard work in bringing this book into production. I think they've done a great job with the photographs and the maps, and I think it looks great. I also want to thank Morgan Haidt, who did the maps for it. And I think they're great because they're so simple and so illuminative of the events that happened. I also want to thank Peter Newbury and Victor Robinson from Hazleton, both of whom read the manuscript and gave me valuable comments on it. And of course, lastly, I want to thank my wife Alice, who was always fully supportive and also had a very keen editor's pencil, which was very valuable to me going through it to start with. So the book, Murders. Murder seems to be such a popular topic these days. You only have to look at the television schedule to see how much of our time on television is taken up by watching murders. So I've taken about a dozen killings and murders from the period between 1884 and 1914 that happened in and around Hazleton on the Skeena River, and just written the stories. And they're great stories, I think. And they range from the killing of Charlie Yeomans, who procrastinated in doing what he had to do and was killed because of it, to the great gunfight in New Hazleton in 1914 in the bank robbery. There's lots of great stories, so I felt I had to tell them. So that's what this book is about. It's some stories of the murders in Hazleton.
I mean, I'm lucky because I got an advanced copy, so I got to read all of them, and I don't want to give away too much, and I don't want you to give away too much either. But could you maybe just expand a little bit on maybe one of your favorite stories?
Oh boy. How about Isaac Jones and William Gordon? Isaac Jones was a Welshman. William Gordon was a Scot. They were coal miners in Nanaimo, and they decided in 1887 to go looking for gold in the Obanika Mountains, which is east of Hazleton. Isaac Jones had the money. William Gordon said he had knowledge of all about the gold streams and where the likely prospects were. They went to Ashcroft, bought their supplies. Well, Isaac Jones had the money, so he bought the supplies for William Gordon. And they rode north. Took about 2 months to get up there. And as they rode up, their relationship deteriorated. And Gordon was quickly seen to be a rather strange person. A lot of people they met on the road on the way up advised Jones to leave him. And reading through the story, I wanted to take hold of him and say, get out now, leave him while you can, because pretty soon it was too late. They both went riding into a stream near Manson Creek in the Armenian Mountains, and Gordon came out with Jones's horse and some other possessions, which he sold. He said Jones had gone south back to Victoria, but no one believed him. And the rumors ran pretty wild. Gordon rode down into Hazleton, where the rumors had preceded him, and everyone suspected he killed his partner, but no one knew where the body was. Now, under English law at the time and Canadian law at the time, unless there was a body, you couldn't charge the person with murder. There had to be a murder. It was a convention of law. And this lasted until the 1950s. So they couldn't arrest him for murder. So Richard Loring, the magistrate, arrested him for theft of Jones's goods. Loring bought back from the First Nations people who'd bought the goods what he'd sold them. And they were pretty dramatic. The tent still had blood on it and bits of brains, it was thought. Jones's coat had a big slash in it, as though made by an axe coming down. Gordon had $700 of money, and he was broke when he started out. So it's pretty clear that he'd done away with his partner. But for 2 or 3 weeks, they sort of circled around each other, trying to find the evidence. Eventually, Gordon was taken down to Victoria, interrogated by the chief of police, who tried to get him to confess. No luck. Gordon was tried for theft, put in prison for about 7 months, and then, because they couldn't find the body, had to be let go. So Gordon, it seems, got away with murder.
I love that you picked that one out, because that was one of my favorite stories.
Yeah.
And then, like, why didn't he just, why didn't he just like leave this guy? How did he not know?
Well, for 2 reasons. First, Jones was a weaker personality, and he became emotionally dependent on his partner. And second, he'd invested money in him. He invested $800 or $900, something like that, probably less, in buying him a horse, buying him his goods, buying him food. And when you've invested some money in someone, you just don't like to give it up.
Yeah,
So,
sunk costs.
Yeah, I mean, he was warned, you've got to leave this guy, but he didn't, and he paid the price.
I'm curious, as you're bringing up some themes like around the policing at the time in the region, and I'm thinking about that, and you having a career as a lawyer, and I'm kind of curious how your career as a lawyer has influenced, your writing style, your researching style for a book on murders.
Well, I'm a historian and always have been a historian as well, and so I very much like going to the original facts. So these stories are based on the evidence taken at the time. There were the witness statements taken from people who saw or had something to contribute. I looked at the trial notes of the judges who presided over some of the trials. I looked at the transcript of the trials, and I looked at letters. So I very much wanted to go back to the original sources to see what the facts at the time told me about what happened.
I love that. I want to maybe understand a little bit more then about what was life like then. You said I pulled a quote from your from the intro because I just loved it so much. You used this quote: "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there."
Yeah.
I know it's not your quote, but I loved it because I was thinking, okay, so as a historian and as a former lawyer, just looking at that time and place and how, the laws governing BC at that time. Can you speak a little bit more to what it might have been like then?
Well, Hazleton was and still is a very beautiful place. It's situated where the Barclay River and the Skeena rivers join. It was very isolated until, for the whole period of this book, there were no roads there. There was no railway there. You either rode there on horseback or walked. And some people did walk or walked, or you went in by steamer up the River Skeena. Now, the river was only open to steamers from 1891 on. And even then, it was only open for 6 months of the year, effectively. So if you lived in Hazleton, you were very much dependent on the food coming up during the summer months. And in one year, 1907, the steamer was turned over by the river, because it's a pretty wild river. It was turned over by the river. And towards the end of the winter, the food was running out. The whiskey and the beer did run out. So they were short of food, and very high prices prevailed, and some very thin horses. So it was very much a frontier town. Even as late as 1910, 1911, it was considered the mule train capital of North America. And there were about 800 or 900 mules operating out of Hazleton to take supplies out to settlers and to people on the telegraph lines who spent for a couple of years on their own in these telegraph cabins on the telegraph route to the north. So it was very much a frontier town. And until about 1900, there weren't many people living there. There was only about 40 or 50 people living in Hazleton until about 1900. And then the population started to expand, and it has reached its peak before, probably before the First World War. So it was a very different time from us, and it's so far away in time from us that we really have a hard time understanding how they thought and how they felt, and what motivated them.
So how, I mean, because the book is so much about the murders, policing is a big part of it. So what would you like to share about, like, what did you learn about the policing part of it?
Well, the first resident policeman didn't arrive there until 1900. That's when things started opening up. The first policeman, the telegraph arrived, the first doctor resident in the interior. Until then, there was a magistrate in town who was an Indian agent, and the process of policing all over the province, in fact, was for the gold commissioner to be the magistrate, or the Indian agent to be the magistrate. So what happened if there was a crime was the magistrate got hold of some people and swore them in as special constables. So it's very much not quite pulling people off the street, but in the case of William Gordon, for example, Richard Loring was in bed with appendicitis when William Gordon turned up in town. And that was a serious disease right then, because there were no doctors anywhere near. So he swore in a man called Joseph Chapman as special constable. Now, Chapman had traveled with Gordon coming up from Ashcroft. So he had a particular feeling about the man. But Chapman was sworn in as a special constable. And he, in fact, arrested him and took him down to Victoria. The posse that James Kirby, the policeman in town, put together after Simon Gunnernoot was thought to have committed the murders. They were all special constables. They were all sworn in as part-time policemen for a few weeks to do the job. So it was very much a unpoliced area where you had the local farmer or the local person who ran the mule trains could be a policeman for a couple of weeks looking for a criminal.
Yeah, I think that that might be one of those things. I kept a bit of a note next to my reading about all the different names as these different constables were sworn in and things, because different names kind of come up from that.
Yes.
Makes a lot of sense. There's also, it feels like, when you talk about the Gunnernoot story and some of these other stories, there's also a lot of interaction that's happening with the First Nations communities there as well. So maybe shine a little bit of a light on what you noticed from, you went back to those original sources and things. So what did you notice about those, in the times, the kind of the conflict, the tension, the connection between the communities?
Well, of course, this is a huge topic, and I'm certainly not an expert on the matter. Certainly on a macro perspective, there's a huge gulf between the races. And on the one side, there was an unchallengeable assumption of superiority and with the instruments of power. And on the other, well, I can't speak for the Gikzan people then or now, but you have to assume that there was a sense of fragmentation and loss. On the macro level, you really have to get into the individual people. And there was a huge variety of actions and thoughts on both sides. Until 1900, on the whole, people got on. After 1900, the gigs and grievances, in many cases totally justified, mounted and increased because it was the government coming in and basically giving away their land, and people were showing up with pieces of paper saying, I've got a government right to live here. And then you've got the fishery officers coming in, disturbing the fishing practices of the Gitxsan people. You had the doctor in the hospital, and that was mixed because although in one sense it was very good for healthcare, on the other hand, there was great disturbance to the traditional ways of life. So after 1900, the population increased and some tensions started to increase that really haven't, we're all working away now with reconciliation, rightly so, but, we have to admit they're still there.
Yeah, it's so interesting that I'm fascinated by the fact that you got to do so much research and kind of send yourself back in time to look at what it was like
Yeah.
then. Can you shine some more light on like how your research process was? I mean, you wrote this book during COVID. Again, how did you do your research? How did you do all of this?
Well, most of the on-site research was done before COVID started. So yeah, I had a couple of books going at the same time, both the Pinkertons and this book. So when I was in the archives in Victoria with my camera, note always take a camera when in the archives, I was able to look at the original documents, photograph them, or look at a microfilm and download them onto a stick. So I came away with a huge amount of the documentation with me before COVID started in terms of photographs of the original documents and the witness statements and the judge's trial notes and the transcriptions of the trial. And then, of course, the newspapers are online. So there's a lot of work going through the newspapers because that's where you find a lot of the color, a lot of this fun stories that don't always turn up in the official documents. So the newspapers, and some of the letters are online, some aren't. So you just dig around, but and you build up the picture, and then you write the book and you go through it again and revise and edit and revise, throw bits out, add bits in. It's a whole process of putting together a book. I'm sure some writers can sit down and just start writing and they don't change anything. They just do 100 words a day or 1,000 words a day or what have you. And then when they've done that, they go on to something else. I can't do it like that. It's a constant process. So it's a relationship with a piece of paper and the factual situation. And you're always going through the facts and changing how you see things and adding things in and molding the text on the page, much as a potter would mold a pot on a wheel.
It's so interesting. Now I'm very curious to learn a little bit more about was there anything that didn't make it to the final cut that you wish was there?
No, but there are a couple of stories that I decided not to include because they weren't my stories. There were some stories in the First Nations community that I felt I shouldn't tell. So I'm not going to tell them now.
Fair. Is for any of us that are curious, is there any way of looking them up for ourselves, or that will have to remain a mystery?
You can always read the newspapers at the time.
Sounds like a fun Friday night.
They're all online. Some are online. Some of the documents are in the Attorney General's correspondence in the archives in Victoria, but they're not my stories.
I love that you're being so honoring whose stories are whose to tell. So thank you for that. Uh, Maybe the thing that I guess is coming up for me is, you talked about molding and shaping, and now I'm curious to know how much is kind of a bit of imagination or recreating where there might have been gaps in spaces, and how much is fact.
I tried not to use my imagination. I tried not to speculate. And where I speculate, I try and say this is speculation. Because as a historian, you've really got to try and have that chain link to the factual line. So I'm hoping there's very little imagination in there. There are a few comments along the way, editorial comments, if you like, or warnings to Isaac Jones from Wales, get out of there quickly while you can. So there's some. So I try not to speculate, but that doesn't mean I leave questions unanswered. There are a number of surprises and a number of questions unanswered. And I tried not to provide the answers merely by speculating.
Would you at least answer us, what do you think happened to the robber? You had one, there's like the big bank robbery one. I don't want to give away too much about what happened. What do you think happened?
I love this story because every story in the book is a little bit more than just a murder. They've all got something that lifts it above the mere fact of someone killing someone else. So in the first story of Charlie Yeomans, who disobeyed Gikazan law, the underlying question is, whose law should apply? British Columbian law or the Gikazan law? Question mark. And there's a surprise at the end of that chapter. But in the gun robbery, in the Union Bank robbery, the added extra is it's almost unbelievably like a scene out of High Noon or Stagecoach or Gunsmoke. It's the real Old West in a gun battle that there aren't many of these in Western Canadian history. Here's a new bank in a new town, New Hazelton, and 7 Russian robbers stalk into town one day and decide to rob it. They're spotted, and the citizens go for their guns. And the leader of the citizens, and you couldn't make this up, the leader of the citizens was the Presbyterian minister, Dan McLean, who was also a crack shot. And the other crack shot among the group was a guy called Arizona Smith. And he ran the hotel. And it was a real gun battle in the old Western corral style. And at the end of it, 2 of the robbers were dead. 1 was fatally wounded. 3 more were badly injured in the chase in the woods, and 1 got away. Unfortunately, he was the one who was carrying the money. It's thought he escaped down the railway, and no one really knows what happened to him afterwards. There were rumors that there were more than 1 robber, that there was some more in the woods who fled when they saw what was happening. No one really knows. But there is a sequel. And one takes this for what it's worth. Many years later, the manager of the Union Bank in Old Hazelton, a man called Hank Little, was having a drink in a bar, and he had a few with some old timers who told him they'd met someone who claimed to be that one last robber who'd escaped. Who knows?
Who knows?
But Hank Little decided it was 20 or 30 years later, and there wouldn't be any evidence, and why bother? So was that an old-timer shoot his mouth off over a beer or not?
I think might be true. I feel like somebody's got to give you a call to like buy the rights to turn that story into another like old, or at least it's got to be a play. It's got to be something. It deserves to be something acted out.
I think it would either be a very good movie or a very bad movie. A very bad movie would be the one with cliches. Guys with black hats, guys with white hats, a good movie could be made of it, but it would take a bit of storytelling.
Yeah, there's a moment in it where you'll have to remind me of what the person's name is. It's the woman who's standing at her restaurant and watching the robbers head towards the bank. I just have this
Oh yeah,
image in my head.
yeah, yeah.
It's like the starting scene.
Myrtle Bigot, I think her name was, and she was the
Mhm.
wife of the restaurant owner, and she counted them and saw them because she was hoping they were going to come in and buy something from the restaurant, from the cafe. So she watched them going up um, the road, and then bullets started flying. Yeah, it's just like something out of a western. And I say it's true because I read all the witness statements, and so it's very closely based on the statements under oath that the witnesses gave at the time.
I have said, even if people don't read the rest of the stories in the book, I don't know why they wouldn't, but this one, I'm like, you got to read this one at least because this one's like a thriller. What I'm so you, I mean, this is your third book. Now, what was the motivation for this one at this time?
Well, they're great stories, I think, and they deserve to be told. As I say, not just because they were murders, but because they've got something extra. You've got the Charlie Yeoman story and the Git Kazan law. You've got the bank robber, and you've got the last story in the book where the accused's brother was the one who testified that the bloodstained shirt near the body was in fact his brother's. And then there was a trial, and he changed his evidence, and there was a bit of a how should we call it? Bit of a not a mess, a bit of a confusion at the end. And I'm not going to tell you what happened.
I won't say
That's a
anything.
fun story.
Yeah, but I was mad. That made me mad. Do you so? Okay, so it needed to be told because these are like fun stories and very interesting stories to tell. Anything about what you're thinking about for your next adventure? Are there more things that are
Oh yes.
percolating in your
Oh
mind?
yes. Yes. Of course there are. Come on. I got two more almost finished, but I'm not going to tell you about them.
Okay.
Sorry.
More mysteries. You give us lots of mysteries, hey? I wonder. I'm looking at the time and wondering if we want to open up the chat for questions to come in, so it's not just us. If anybody out there has questions, I'd love to take some of those in for Geoff as well as we continue our conversation here. So open that up. Let's see, what else do I really want to know about? I'm kind of just thumbing this book. I guess I have more curiosities about things like the region and, just who all of the players are at that time. You talked a little bit about at the beginning about, the maps of the region and things. Just wondering if you could illustrate a little bit more about the people.
Well, Hazleton was founded in 1871, and it was founded largely because of the gold rush in the Armenian Mountains to the east. Now, there were two ways to get up to the Armenian Mountains, two main ways. One was to get on a horse at Ashcroft and ride, or walk, and people did walk. It's a long way, but yeah. Or you got in a canoe at Port Essington and went up the river that way.
How long would that be?
In the canoe, it depends on the state of the river, but it would be 6 to 14 days. 6 days was okay, but when the steamers went up, starting in 1891, it took at a minimum 4 days. 6-7 days was the average, but it could take you 3 weeks. The river was a fierce river. It drops almost 1,000 feet, 900 feet between Hazleton and the coast, which is 180 miles away. And going through the Kitslass Canyon, it can rise 10 feet in 24 hours or drop 10 feet in 24 hours. It was a beast of a river to go up. It was also quite shallow in places. It was also quite, there were lots of little hairpin bends steamers had to take. And as I mentioned before, at one point the river turned over. A steamer, I mean, this steamer took 120 people on board. It was not a small thing. It was a sort of decent-sized steamer, the Mount Royal it was called. So the way in was by canoe until 1891 and then by steamer, 6 months of the year. In 1871, it became a bit of a small, I wouldn't say a boom village, but there were some cabins and shacks and a lot of tents. And even by 1900, the population was only about 40. But there are a lot of transients, people, miners going up and down the river. And it was founded because a chap called Tom Hankin wanted to build a store there to sell goods to the people going up and down the river. Now, I should say there are two communities in Hazelton. There's a traditional community of Gittanmaks, which is the center of the Gitxsan nation. And then there's the smaller town of Hazelton, which is completely surrounded by the Gitxsan reserve. And the population of the village of Gittanmaks was 200, 300, 400. So it was a much larger place. So you had these two communities existing together with a lot of people passing up and down. And then you had the usual characters you'd found in the small town. You had the Indian agent, you had the missionaries, you had the merchants, and mule train drivers. And after 1900, you had, as things started to grow, you had the doctor, Dr. Wrench, and the telegraph operator, and stores started opening up in Hazelton. Now, when the railway came, it had to come along the south of the river bank, and this is where a map would come in handy, of course. It had to come along the south of the river bank, up the Skeena, and then down the Bulkley River. So it couldn't never cross over to Hazelton. So a new town called New Hazelton grew up on the south side of the river. And a second town, or a third town, called South Hazelton grew up also at much the same time. And the rivalry between the two is for another time, another place. But so there is a smaller, quieter community. New Hazelton was one that won. And that's where a lot of the mining was centered. A lot of the banks were centered. So these communities grew up. And as the settlement of the Bulkley Valley grew, a lot more people came in by train, and there's a small mining boom before 1900 as a lot of the ore was developed and taken up by train. So up until the First World War, it's quite a coming place. First World War quenched much of the economic activity in the area.
So fascinating. So I get this sense that real Wild West when you talk about the transient nature of the folks coming in and out, and of the tension that was there between the communities too. And just looking at the questions, and maybe I'll ask one from Liz, I believe. Liz is asking, did anyone of the Gitxsan Nation read and give feedback on this book? Maybe I'll expand that a little wider just to understand more about, I know you mentioned in your book getting some advisory counsel from folks in the Gitxsan Nation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that for us?
Yes, I did have some input from someone in the Gitxsan Nation at Hazelton. So I did, yes.
And what was their input like? Can you share anything more about how you worked with them?
He read parts of the book that were, because only a couple of chapters actually deal with Gitxsan matters. So he read those chapters and gave us feedback. which I fed into the book, and they're very good advice too. There's some advice on some of the names, because the names are, some of the names that we used at the time are not names that are familiar now, which gave me a bit of a problem, because I had to solve it by using the names of some of the people at the time, as they were used at the time in the documents. So I use some of them, even though some of them may not be familiar now.
Yeah, I really appreciated in the book how you share at the beginning how you're using names and what ones that you'll stay consistent with. I really appreciated also where you edited any of the words that were different so we could match back to something that might have been in the transcript. That must have been really challenging.
One of the problems is that there was not any consistency whatsoever in how names were spelt. So you'd find a name like Kispiox spelt differently, even in the same sentence. So it became very difficult to decide how to use a name like Kispiox. And then of course there's pronunciation as well, which is difficult for me. And Kispiox has another name, and both names are on the sign outside Kispiox. And I can't even try to pronounce it. It's Anspyax, but there are many. It's difficult for me anyway. So I tried to address the problem by describing the problem in the introduction and saying, "Sorry, folks, I don't get it right, but this is the best I can do."
Yeah, it was challenge. I mean, that's such a challenge. I personally think you did a good job, like dealing with that challenge. Maybe good time to ask a question from Peter, who's asking, how has your writing style changed over the course of the 3 books?
I think I've been greatly assisted by some really good editors, because I don't think my style has changed dramatically, but I've been far more aware of style points that editors, and I'm thinking of Meg Yamamoto, who helps with Caitlin, who's been very, very good. I mean, tiny things like the differences between N dashes and M dashes, and how you properly set out references and notes. So I don't think my style has changed, but I think I've become very much more aware of those little points that make such a difference to a clearly written book.
Maybe I could share, since I've read all 3 of them. One thing that I feel like I felt in this book is it flows. I don't know how to. I'm not an editor. I'm not but there's a flow to it. It's like each chapter has such a. There's like even the ones that don't end up having the answer that we want. It has such a beginning, middle, end. It has such a flavor to each one. I've actually said, as people have asked me, like, oh, should I read this book? I'm like, yes. Even if you just read one chapter at a time, it's like its own beautiful, crisp little story. They're beautiful all on their own. So
Well,
I really appreciate that about this one.
Thank you. Yeah, I tried to pay attention to the structure of the story, and not always deal with it chronologically, but to put a nugget of interest at the beginning to sort of pull the reader in. Yeah, it just came together. But something I always do with anything I write is to read it aloud. Because if it can be read aloud comfortably, then it can be read comfortably. So I always try and read it aloud.
I love that. That is good advice for lots of things. Steve's asking, if you had an opportunity to ask a question directly to any of the characters in the book, what would you ask? I feel like we need a microphone for this. What would you ask?
Yeah, this is putting me on the spot here. I'd almost go to a story that we haven't mentioned yet, which isn't actually a murder story. The chap was almost lynched, to try and find out who, in fact, whose fault was it? Who do we blame here? Because this is the story of William Grider. And we're all familiar with the stories of the Klondike and the gold rush fever that infected people. A rogue called Jimmy Wells, who was actually the gold commissioner up in the Armenian, went down to Victoria with a nugget that was described as being like a bit of Christmas pudding with a sixpence sticking out of gold. And he persuaded or showed it to a chap called William Grider, who was an American from California, saying, there's plenty of the stuff where this comes from. Give me a number of $100 and I'll tell you where it is. And William Grider was hooked. And he went back to California and persuaded about 70 or 80 people, mostly from Stockton, California, to come with him to look for gold in the Armenian Mountains. A lot of them sold their houses. There are sad stories of people selling their houses to raise the money. They each paid Grider some money, and he brought them up to the Skeena, which he couldn't get up because it hadn't opened yet. It was all icebound. So they hiked in over the Nass, which wasn't quite as bad as the Chilkoot Trail, but it was pretty bad. When they got to Hazelton, the miners realized that Grider had no idea what he was talking about. And they wanted to lynch him. And he ran away and hid. And they ran after him and found him. And speculation warning, they couldn't find a tree to hang him on. Because at that point on the back of Hazelton, there were a few shacks, a few tents, but no trees. So they wanted to hang. We know they wanted to hang him. We know they had the rope. But the moment passed, and Richard Loring, the Indian agent magistrate, stepped in and stopped it. And now they were broke. Hazelton had no food because they were running out of food because the winter was ending, and they're all waiting for the first food to come upriver by steamer. These guys are starving. So who do you blame? Do you blame Jimmy Wells, who basically told him a pretty big story, which really wasn't true? But maybe it was true because there was gold in the mountains. But or do you blame Grider for being a fraud or just gullible? And I can't make up my own mind whether Grider was a fraud or just gullible and foolish.
Do you want to ask him a question there?
I would certainly want to ask him a question, yes.
Or maybe two.
I can sit him down and get some sense out of him.
I'd almost forgotten about that story. It made me think about, how investors sometimes invest in some foolhardy things that they don't know much about.
Yup. Not much changes.
I was thinking, yeah, exactly. We've got a question from Lav, and they're asking, did most of the crimes happen during certain times of the year, spring, winter, fall, or summer?
Well, winter was pretty brutal up there. The climate, even by 1900, Old Times was saying climate was changing. And the snow would be on the ground for 3 or 4 months. And the river would be frozen for 3 or 4 months or unpassable. So in winter, people pretty much kept to themselves, which decreases the opportunity for time. But certainly, of crime. So certainly, most of the crimes I'd talk about happen when weather was good, just running through them. The gun and the story of June, the 2 bank robberies, one was in November, And I haven't mentioned the first bank robbery yet, November. The second was in May. The murder of Bert Taylor, the last story, happened in October. Yeah, it's mostly in good weather.
That's such an interesting observation to make. Crime equals good weather, or good weather equals crime.
Well, maybe that's just the way it happened.
Maybe. Is there anything you want to share about that first bank robbery?
Well, it's a fun little robbery. Happened in the Union Bank opened up in 1913 in New Hazelton. One had opened up in Old Hazelton not long before, and up till then there was not much cash around. People really did take around little bags of gold dust to pay for things, or some of the merchant stores issued their own tokens. So there's still a few tokens around. There's even a Charlie Yeomans token from the 1880s somewhere. But the cash really helped the economy develop. And some robbers noticed this too. And 3 or 4 of them broke into the bank in daylight, in the evening in October. I think it was October in 1913. And a teller in there was called Geoff Mynett, 19 years old, and one of the robbers shot him in the face, point blank range, and obviously fell to the ground bleeding. The robbers took some money, not much, because they couldn't open the safe, and escaped. Everyone, of course, was very upset about poor Jock. The doctor was over from Old Hazelton fairly quickly, and he said, the guy's not going to die, but we've got to get into hospital to be x-rayed. Now, the hospital x-ray, I think, was on site at the time, but hadn't yet been installed. So he was taken down to Prince Rupert, then to Vancouver. Now, Geoff Mynett, I'll back up 1 second. In the search for the robbers, someone, by accident, negligence, shot someone dead. He was charged with murder. It was the wrong person. He was charged with murder, and it went into the courts. They determined it was purely accidental, and police didn't press charges. So there is a body in the story. Geoff Mynett was taken down to Vancouver and operated on. The surgeon decided not to remove the bullet. A few months later, in June of 1914, Geoff Mynett disappeared. And the newspapers were full of rumors like, had he escaped with some money because he'd gone back to work at the bank, or had his mind been affected by the bullet in his brain, Geoff Mynett had disappeared. Where was Jock? No one knew. Now, Hank Little, who was a bank manager in Old Hazelton, many years later, met a friend, I'm talking 20 or 30 years, I think, was in Scotland at a football match. And at his football match, he was sitting next to a chap who asked him for a match to light a cigarette. And they got chatting, as one does at soccer matches. And it turned out this was Geoff Mynett, who had gone back to England, enlisted in the First World War, fought in the war, survived the war, and he'd been a civil servant in Edinburgh all his life. So Geoff Mynett survived his brush with death. But yeah, he had a bullet pushed in his face, and instinctively he put up his hand like that, and the bullet hit his thumb, and it deflected it enough, so it landed somewhere here in his face. So he was quite lucky, was Jock. There could have been another murder there.
Oh my goodness. Okay, but hang on 1 sec. Wasn't Hank Little, maybe I got it wrong, but wasn't Hank Little the same guy who 30 years later from the second bank robber?
Yeah. Same guy.
Hank Little, how are you making the rounds like this and 30 years on?
Well, I'll tell you how, because he wrote an article for a newspaper and it was published in 1952 or something. I think the Interior News, I'm not sure. of life in the old Hazleton, and these stories came up of how he'd been involved, how he knew something about both bank robberies.
Interesting.
So that's how Hank comes up.
He's an interesting character, in my opinion. Okay, Duncan's got a question. He's asking, Hazleton was a small town and you have described several murders there. Do you think that Hazleton had a higher crime rate than other small towns?
I haven't researched all the other small towns in British Columbia. It seems a lot to me. And I just don't know. I don't know of any other town, small town, that had the same number of murders. You go to, not Prince Rupert, because Prince Rupert didn't exist till 1906, but Quesnel, Hope, Yale, probably in the early days of the gold rush. But for this period, I'm not aware of any. It seems a lot to me. I think it's a lot.
It felt like a lot for such a small population. But also that's interesting when you said like the gold rush. Were other small towns in BC also part of the gold rush at the same time?
The nature of the gold rush is miners go to one stream or one river, prospect it, work it out, and then someone else has found somewhere else. So you had the Fraser River and Yale and Hope, Alexandria, Quesnel, Barkerville, etc., etc., etc. So that people leapt from one site to another. And there was one in the early 1860s on the Skeena, and then gold was found on the Skeena River in the 1860s, and in the Armenian Mountains again in the early 1860s. Now, there were a number of different creeks in the Armenian Mountains, and Manson Creek was one that was found in 1869, and that pulled people up to the north. And in 1870, there's one, a place called Yeomans Creek, and that started the real Armenian gold rush of 1871. And people flooded in up the Skeena River. And at one point in 1871, there were 1,200 miners on a few creeks up in the Armenica. But by middle of 1872, that had panned out, and they all found somewhere else to go. And then you had the last major one at Atlin on the northern border of the Yukon. But gold was still in the mountains. So even after the gold rush in the Armenica Mountains of 1871 had petered out, there was still gold there, and there were still miners there coming to find it. So, and they may still be, I don't know. There was still gold in the mountains being found in the 1920s and 1930s. So there were some miners there all the time looking for it, going to find streams no one had looked at. But the big gold rush of the Armenica was 1869, 1870, 1871 into 72.
Okay. You got me thinking, Duncan's question there, like, so is there a correlation between, gold mining, transient towns, and murders? And what else might you discover about BC's history?
Lots. Lots to find. It's a fascinating history, and Hazleton, which is a beautifully situated town, is one of the historic places in the province, because Fort St. James was a Northwest Company trading post, and the Hudson's Bay Company took over that in 1821. And the Hudson's Bay Company was trying to maintain or establish this monopoly of trading in the north, and to keep out the Yankees and the Russians and the Brits from the coast. And they sent a man called Simon McGilvery in 1833. And although the indigenous people had lived there for millennia, he was the first non-indigenous person to get there in 1833. And this was 10 years before Victoria was founded. And of course, 40 years before Vancouver was founded. So, I mean, Hazelton has a long, long history. And it's fascinating.
I love how you make the history of our. I would like to go there one day. One day, sponsored by Tourism Hazelton. Just kidding. But you do make history come alive. Like as you share dates and things, I'm like, this is fascinating stuff, and you do such a great job of making it come alive. So I hope anybody that hasn't read this book or hasn't picked it up yet will pick it up because they've heard you talking about it tonight.
Thank
and
you.
I see Malika is here, so I will and let Malika take over.
I mean, this was such a fascinating discussion. And while you guys were speaking, I kept on thinking of people who I want to buy the book for Christmas. And
I've been thinking about
the
that
fact
too.
that you can read it one story at a time. You know, I find that like, especially if you're busy and you have a lot of things on the go, it's so nice to just be able to read one story and not have the pressure to read an entire book all at once.
Yeah, there are some to the end of it.
Yeah, but there are surprises. Quite a few chapters have surprises at the end,
which makes it even better.
I know. I just loved like picking it up and being like, I'm gonna read one story tonight, and I would read one story and just be immersed in one story. It felt. I just really enjoyed that. I'm likely gonna go back and reread some of them again.
Well, I mean,
Rachel, thank you.
Yeah, this is so interesting, and it's almost sad that we have to end it at some point, and we can't just keep on talking about murders and Hazelton because, there's so many other questions that I'm even thinking of right now that I want to ask, but then we would be here until midnight, and we would all be too scared to sleep. But I want to remind everybody that you can buy the book by just clicking on the little green button at the bottom of the screen. And it's been so nice of everyone to come out and ask these wonderful questions. And in the chat, I see that we have a lot of people from Hazelton, someone from Edmonton even. Edmonton's my hometown, so that's great to see. Naramata, Vancouver. Yeah, so many people joining us from all over. So thank you so much. And again, thank you to our funders. And Geoff and Crystal, I'll let you guys, if there's anything else that you wanted to quickly share. If not, I can, just say goodnight to everybody.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Crystal, for your questions.
Of course. Thank you for sharing so openly and giving us an insider view. I really enjoyed our conversation, as always.
Thank you to both of you.
We should do it again sometime, Crystal. We should do this again. We should do this again sometime.
Well, you kind of mentioned, but like didn't mention that there will be future books. So like, hopefully we get to do it again.
Fingers crossed. All right. Have a wonderful evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us. All right. Take care.
Okay. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.